Do. By the second night of the blizzard, the Kestrel Ranch was disappearing under snow. Wind screamed through the broken barn wall at 50 miles an hour. Inside, 3 children huddled by a dying fire. Their father lay unconscious in the next room. Do. Fever, burning through him like a brand. There was no doctor for 30 miles, no neighbor close enough to hear a scream. Only a woman no one had asked to stay. 6 days earlier, she'd knocked on that door with nothing but a torn coat and a desperate offer. Let me stay. Do. I'll raise your kids. He'd almost turned her away. Now the fire was failing, the roof was groaning under the weight of snow, and somewhere out in that whiteout, one wrong decision would bury them all before morning. She wasn't family. She wasn't even hired help. Do. But by sunrise, this ranch would only still be standing because of her. If this story pulls you in, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, and hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the storm finally breaks. Now, do. Let's go back to where it all began. 6 days before the blizzard, Ivy Coleridge walked the last stretch of frozen road into Kestrel Ranch with blistered feet and a stomach that hadn't held a full meal in 2 days. She was 26, alone, and carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a letter of reference. No rancher in 3 counties had bothered to read past the first line. Widow. No children of her own, willing to work for room and board. 4 ranches had already said no. 1 man had laughed in her face. Another had looked at her hands, softened from years of school teaching, and told her flatly she wouldn't last a week. Ivy kept walking anyway, because behind her was nothing, and ahead of her was at least a chance. Kestrel Ranch did not look like it was waiting for anyone. The fence line sagged. The barn door hung crooked on one hinge. Smoke rose thin and gray from the chimney, as though even the fire inside had given up trying. And there, standing in the yard with an axe still in his hand, was Silas Kestrel, a man who looked like winter had already gotten to him early. His coat was patched at both elbows. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from cold, but from nights without sleep. Behind him in the doorway, 3 children watched the stranger with the kind of silence that only comes from kids who've learned not to hope out loud. What Ivy didn't know yet was that Silas had buried more than a wife that fall. He had buried the version of himself who believed he could still keep this family whole alone, and every day since had been a slow admission that he was losing. Silas didn't ask her name first. He asked what she wanted. Ivy told him the truth, plain and unshaken. She'd heard in town that his wife had passed in the fall, that he was working the ranch alone with 3 children under 10, and that he hadn't hired anyone because he couldn't pay. She said she didn't need pay. She needed a roof, and she was willing to earn it. Silas studied her for a long moment, the kind of look a man gives something he's certain will break under pressure. Then he said the only thing that mattered. He didn't need a housekeeper. He needed someone who could actually raise 3 children through a Wyoming winter. Because he was failing at it alone, and he knew it. That was when Ivy said the words that would follow her through everything that came after. Let me stay. I'll raise your kids. She didn't dress it up. She didn't ask for anything more than shelter and work. Silas looked at her like she'd offered him something he didn't believe still existed on the frontier, someone willing to give before asking to receive. He almost said no. His hand was already on the door, ready to close it against the cold and against her. But then the youngest, a girl no older than 4, tugged at his sleeve and asked if the lady could stay just for supper. Something in Silas's chest gave way that he wouldn't admit to for weeks. He set the terms flatly. The way a man does when he's afraid to sound grateful. A room off the kitchen. Meals shared at the table, not standing at the stove like hired help. No wages until spring if the ranch made it that far. And one condition he repeated twice. As if saying it once wasn't enough to protect himself. This was temporary, just until he found someone better suited, or until the roads opened enough for her to move on to somewhere with a real future. Ivy agreed without hesitation. Though something in the way she said it made him wonder if she believed him any more than she believed the wind outside would stop before dark. What Silas didn't know, what none of them knew that first evening, was that Ivy hadn't walked into Kestrel Ranch by accident. She'd heard the name in town from a shopkeeper who mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the Kestrel place had lost 2 hired hands that fall and that folks were starting to whisper the ranch wouldn't survive another season. Most people heard that story and stayed away. Ivy heard it and changed her direction. She had her own reasons for needing a place no one else wanted, a name she was running from, and a debt she couldn't pay in any town with a courthouse. Reasons she kept folded as tightly as the letter in her bag. She had chosen Kestrel Ranch precisely because it was failing. Because a man too tired to ask questions was a man who wouldn't look too closely at hers. Silas would not learn any of it until it was far too late to send her away. The first night, Ivy did something no one asked her to do. After the children were finally asleep, after Silas had gone quiet by the stove with a bottle he hadn't opened in weeks, she walked the length of the house with a lantern, the same way a person checks locks before a storm they can't yet see coming. She found the loose shutter latch on the north window first. Then the gap beneath the back door where wind had already carved a thin drift of snow across the floorboards. Silas watched her from his chair without speaking, and for the first time since his wife had died, he felt something other than exhaustion settle into the room. He didn't yet understand that the woman quietly checking his windows had just started counting every weakness in a house that was about to be tested by the worst storm the territory had seen in a decade. By the third day, the children had stopped watching her like a stranger. The middle boy, Tobias, followed her to the woodpile without being asked and started stacking logs the way she showed him, shortest to longest, so the pile wouldn't topple in high wind. The oldest, Clara, still hadn't spoken a full sentence to her, but Ivy noticed the girl had begun leaving her chores half-finished in places where Ivy would naturally pick them up, as if testing whether she'd actually follow through or vanish like the last two hands had. Silas noticed it too and said nothing, because he was doing the same test in his own way, waiting to see how long her promise would hold once the real cold arrived. Then, on the fourth night, a rider came up the frozen road just after dark, moving too fast for good news. He didn't dismount. He just called out that the sky over the Bitterroot Pass had turned the color of a bruise, and that every rancher between here and the county line needed to lock down before sundown tomorrow, because what was coming wasn't an ordinary storm. Old-timers were already calling it the worst system to drop out of Canada in 11 years, and the last one had killed men who thought they knew these hills better than anyone alive. Silas stepped out into the yard and looked north, where the horizon had already begun to swallow the stars. He counted in his head everything on this ranch that wasn't yet fixed, and the list was longer than the hours he had left to fix it. Behind him, Ivy stood in the doorway with Clara's small hand gripped tightly in hers, and for the first time since arriving at Kestrel Ranch, her calm, steady expression finally cracked, because she alone understood exactly how unprepared this house truly was. Ivy didn't sleep that night. Long after Silas had banked the fire and gone still in his chair, she sat at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil, writing a list by lamplight the way she used to write lesson plans for children who no longer existed in her life. Firewood. Water barrels filled and covered, the loose shutter, the gap under the back door, the barn roof which she'd noticed sagged on the northwest corner the very first afternoon, though she'd said nothing about it yet. Unsure if pointing out a man's failures on her third day was a way to earn trust or lose it. By the time gray light touched the window, she had 11 items on that list, and less than one full day left to finish them. She woke Tobias and Clara before the sun was fully up, which neither child had experienced from anyone besides their mother, and something in Clara's face shifted when Ivy handed her a task instead of an order. Pack every blanket in the house into the front room, she said, even the ones that smell like mothballs. Even the ones you think are too small to matter. Clara hesitated, then did it without being asked twice. Tobias, meanwhile, was sent to the woodpile with instructions that made no sense to a 9-year-old boy until Ivy explained them plainly. Stack it inside the porch, not just beside it, because wet wood in a blizzard is no better than no wood at all. Silas watched his children move with a purpose he hadn't seen in months and said nothing, though his jaw tightened every time Ivy gave an order in his own house without asking permission first. By mid-morning, the tension finally broke. Silas found her on a ladder against the barn, hammer in hand, driving nails into a roof section that had been loose since before his wife died. He shouted up at her to get down, that this wasn't a job for a woman who'd been hired to mind children, not fix buildings. Ivy didn't come down right away. She finished the row of nails first, then looked at him with an expression that had nothing soft left in it. She told him plainly that a roof over 3 children's heads mattered more than his pride, and that if he wanted her gone after the storm, she'd go without a fight, but she wasn't about to watch this family freeze because a man was too proud to let a stranger hold a hammer. Silas stood there in the yard, fists clenched, saying nothing, because there was nothing true he could say back. What he didn't tell her, what he could barely admit to himself, was that the last time anyone had climbed onto that roof, it had been his wife, the summer before she died. And watching another woman do the same work in the same spot had knocked something loose in his chest he wasn't ready to name. What none of them saw coming was the second rider, arriving just past noon, Not with news of the storm, but with a folded paper and a badge pinned crooked to his coat. He asked for Ivy Coleridge by her full name, in a tone that made Clara stop sweeping and Tobias stop stacking wood entirely. Ivy's hands went still at the wash basin. "Do." She turned slowly, and for a moment the calm, capable woman who had spent 3 days fixing this ranch looked like she might bolt straight into the tree line rather than answer a single question. Silas stepped between her and the rider without thinking. "Do." An instinct he couldn't yet explain even to himself, and asked what business a deputy had walking onto his land uninvited. The deputy said only that a woman matching Ivy's description was wanted for questioning back in Larimer County. "Do." Connected to a fire that had burned down a boarding house the previous spring, a fire that had killed the man who owned it. He didn't say she'd done it. He didn't say she hadn't. He simply said the county sheriff wanted her found before the roads closed for winter. "Do." And that he intended to bring her back with him that same afternoon. Ivy's face had gone the color of the snow already gathering on the porch rail, and for the first time since arriving at Kestrel Ranch, she didn't have a single steady word to offer in her own defense. "Do." If you've ever been judged for something you didn't get the chance to explain, or watched someone else get written off before anyone heard their side, drop "never judge" in the comments right now. Do. Because what happens in the next few minutes decides whether this family ever finds out the truth about the woman standing in their kitchen. Silas looked at Ivy for a long moment, the storm building behind his eyes, just as surely as the one building over the Bitterroots. "Do." And he asked her one question, quiet enough that the deputy almost didn't hear it. "Did you do it?" Ivy didn't answer right away. She looked past him at Clara, standing frozen in the doorway with a broom still in her hands. "Do." And something in that child's face seemed to decide what came out of her mouth next. "No," she said. "But I know who did, and I couldn't prove it before the fire took the only man who could have backed me." The deputy wasn't interested in explanations. "Do." He stepped forward to take her by the arm, and that was when Silas did something that surprised even himself, something he would spend the rest of that winter trying to understand. He put his hand flat against the man's chest and told him, "Do," in a voice that left no room for argument, that no one was leaving this ranch in the next 12 hours, storm warning or not. "Do." Because the sky over the pass had already turned the color of a fresh bruise, and any man who tried to ride out now was gambling with more than one life. The deputy looked north, saw the same wall of gray Silas had seen the night before, and for the first time hesitated. "Do." Ivy stood frozen between the two men, the truth of her past finally spoken out loud for the first time in months, watching to see whether the roof she'd nailed down that morning, the wood she'd stacked, the blankets Clara had gathered, would end up sheltering her through the very storm that might also be the thing that saved her from being dragged away in chains before she ever got the chance to prove her innocence. Somewhere behind her, Tobias whispered a question to his sister that neither adult in the yard heard, but that would matter more than anyone realized before this day was over. "If the lady leaves, does that mean the storm gets her too?" The deputy finally lowered his hand from his holster, muttering that he'd wait until morning, that no fugitive was getting far in a blizzard anyway, and that this ranch had better still be standing when the roads cleared enough for him to finish what he came to do. He tied his horse in the barn Ivy had just repaired, took a seat by the very fire she had banked the night before, and settled in to wait out the storm alongside the woman he had ridden 2 days through the cold to arrest. Silas closed the door against the wind already picking up outside, looked at Ivy across the room, and realized that whatever happened in the hours ahead, the two of them were now bound to the same roof, the same fate, and the same rapidly closing window before the whole world outside turned white. The wind hit Kestrel Ranch just after midnight. And it did not arrive gently. It came in a single violent gust that tore the porch door from Silas's hand and slammed it against the wall hard enough to crack the frame. Within minutes, the temperature outside had fallen faster than anyone in that house had ever felt it fall, and the world beyond the windows disappeared into a churning wall of white. Deputy Wren Halloway, who had spent the evening pacing the kitchen with one eye on Ivy and the other on the door, finally sat down by the fire and admitted, in a voice stripped of its earlier authority, that he had never seen a storm build that fast in 15 years of riding this territory. Out past the fence line, the wind found every gap the ranch had carried for years, whistling low through the eaves like something searching the house room by room for a way in. Ivy moved through the house like she'd been preparing for this exact night her whole life, checking each window latch a second time, filling every basin with water before the pump could freeze solid, and pulling every blanket Clara had gathered into a single pile near the hearth where the children could sleep without ever leaving the warmth of the fire. Do. Silas watched her work and found himself doing something he hadn't expected, following her instructions without questioning them, handing her nails before she asked for them. Do. Holding the lantern steady while she checked the chimney flue for the same kind of blockage that had nearly smoked out half the ranches in the county the winter before. There was a rhythm to the way she moved through crisis, calm where he expected panic, do, decisive where he expected hesitation, and he found himself wondering how many other storms this woman had already survived, long before she ever set foot on his land. Neither of them spoke about the fire in Larimer County. There wasn't time, do, and there wasn't room in a night like this for anything except the storm bearing down on four walls that had never been tested this hard before. Just before 2 a.m, do. The barn door Ivy had repaired that same morning took a direct hit from wind gusting past 60 miles an hour, and the sound of splintering wood cut through the noise of the blizzard loud enough that everyone in the kitchen froze at once. Do. Silas grabbed a coil of rope without a word and moved for the door, and Ivy was already tying it around her own waist before he could tell her to stay inside with the children. He argued for exactly 1 sentence before giving up. Do. Because the look on her face made it clear that arguing with her about which of them belonged out in that storm was a fight he had already lost the moment she picked up the rope. They found the barn's east wall bowing inward under the weight of drifted snow. Do. The same section Ivy had flagged on her list 2 nights earlier as needing reinforcement she hadn't gotten to yet. And for one terrible moment, do. Both of them understood exactly what would happen to the 6 cattle and the 1 milk cow inside if that wall gave way completely. Silas braced his shoulder against the timber while Ivy drove a support beam into the frozen ground at an angle he'd never have thought to use. Do. Something she said she'd learned from a carpenter who'd once rebuilt her family's barn back before everything in her life had burned down around her. Do. And for a moment neither of them mentioned that the word burned had just slipped out of her mouth for the first time all night. The beam bit into the ground, held for a breath, then shifted half an inch under the pressure. Do. And Silas felt his own pulse spike as he threw his full weight against it, shouting for Ivy to drive a second stake before the first one gave out entirely. The wall held, but barely, and Silas realized as they stumbled back toward the house that the wind wasn't weakening. Do. It was still building. Inside, Deputy Holloway had pulled Clara and Tobias close to the fire and, without anyone asking him to, was telling them a story about a horse he'd once owned that had survived 3 winters in worse country than this. Do. It was such an unexpected kindness from a man who'd arrived that same day to drag their guardian away in chains that Silas stopped in the doorway just to watch it, snow melting off his coat onto the floor. Do. And something in his chest twisted at the sight of a man capable of gentleness and duty at the same time. Clara, who hadn't spoken a full sentence to Ivy in 3 days, was asking Holloway question after question about the horse. Do. Her earlier suspicion of every stranger in this house softening in a way none of them had expected from a man wearing a badge. Holloway caught Silas's eye over the children's heads and said quietly that he'd been thinking about what Ivy told him earlier, about the fire. Do. About a man who might have set it and let an innocent woman take the blame, and that something about her story had been sitting wrong with him ever since she said it. That was when Tobias, half asleep against Holloway's arm, Do, mumbled something that made every adult in the room go still. He said a man's name, a name none of them had spoken all night, a name that belonged, as it turned out, to the very rancher who had ridden past Kestrel Ranch 3 days earlier. Do. The same afternoon Ivy first arrived, offering Silas money for a stretch of grazing land that bordered the northern fence line, money Silas had turned down without a second thought. Ivy's face went pale in the firelight. She asked Tobias, Do, as gently as she could manage with her hands trembling, how he knew that name. And the boy said simply that he'd heard the man talking to himself out by the fence 2 nights ago, saying something about a fire and a debt finally settled. Do. Not realizing a 9-year-old boy gathering kindling nearby could hear every word. Holloway leaned forward, all trace of exhaustion gone from his face, and asked Tobias to say the name again, slower this time, because if the boy was right, Do. Everything the county had believed about that fire for the better part of a year was about to come apart. The wind chose that exact moment to find the weakest point in the whole house. Do. A section of roof above the back bedroom that had been patched years ago and never properly replaced. And the sound of shingles tearing away sent Silas and Ivy both bolting from their chairs at once. Holloway grabbed a lantern and followed without hesitation. Do. Deputy's badge forgotten, storm-bound stranger becoming, in the space of one violent gust, simply another set of hands this family desperately needed. They reached the bedroom to find snow already pouring through a gap in the ceiling wide enough to fit an arm through. Wind screaming through the opening loud enough to drown out every voice in the room. And beyond that gap nothing but a churning, screaming darkness that showed no sign of slowing before morning. Silas grabbed a spare board and pressed it against the widening hole with both hands, shouting for something, anything, to brace it with, while Ivy searched the hallway for the nails she'd left there only hours earlier. Praying they hadn't rolled out of reach in the chaos. No sign of the storm caring whether the truth about that fire, or the family fighting to survive beneath this crumbling roof, ever made it through the night alive. The board held, but only because Ivy found the nails in time, driving them through frozen fingers while Silas pinned the plank against the widening gap with the full weight of his shoulder. For nearly 20 minutes, neither of them said a word, working by lantern light while snow hissed against the boards and the wind tried, again and again, to find a new way through. Somewhere below them the children slept on undisturbed, and it struck Silas, even in the middle of the chaos, that keeping that particular kind of peace intact was worth every splinter driven into his palms. When the last nail finally went in and the gap sealed shut, Silas slid down against the wall and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the moment the deputy first rode into his yard. Ivy sat down beside him, both of them soaked through and shaking, and for the first time all night, neither of them reached for a task to fill the silence. Holloway found them there a few minutes later, Clara and Tobias asleep at last by the fire, and he crouched down across from Ivy with the same careful patience he'd used telling stories about horses hours earlier. He told her plainly that a boy's whispered memory of a name wasn't proof, not the kind that would clear her in a courtroom, but that it was enough to reopen a case everyone in Larimer County had considered closed the moment the fire took the only witness who could have spoken for her. He said the rancher's name out loud for the first time that night, Bertram Cole, and asked Ivy directly whether that name meant anything to her. Ivy's hands stopped shaking for the first time since the deputy had arrived that afternoon, and she told him everything she'd been too afraid to say to anyone, since the night the boarding house burned to the ground, with her only proof of innocence trapped inside it. She'd overheard Cole threatening the boarding house owner weeks before the fire, over a debt the man refused to forgive, a debt tied to land Cole desperately wanted and couldn't legally take any other way. She'd tried to warn the owner, standing in his doorway one evening, and telling him plainly to watch his back around a man who smiled too easily when he talked about money. She'd been standing in the hallway the night the fire started, close enough that half the town assumed she'd said it herself, rather than believe a woman alone could have simply been in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. The only man who could have confirmed her warning, the only man who'd heard Cole's threat alongside her, had died in that same fire, and Ivy had spent the months since running from a truth no one seemed interested in hearing, sleeping in barns when strangers allowed it and walking frozen roads when they didn't, right up until the night she knocked on Silas Kestrel's door, with nothing left to offer but a promise to raise his children. If you've ever carried the weight of a truth nobody believed, something you knew was real, even while the whole world treated you like a liar, you already understand exactly what kept Ivy walking those 6 days before she ever reached this ranch. By morning, the storm had finally begun to loosen its grip, the wind falling from a scream to a low, exhausted moan, and the gray light creeping over the horizon revealed a ranch that had taken real damage but somehow impossibly still stood. The barn wall held, the roof held, every animal inside was alive, and every person inside that house was breathing, which was more than half the ranches scattered across that county would be able to say once the roads finally opened. Holloway rode out at first light, not toward Larimer County to deliver Ivy in chains, but toward Bertram Cole's property, with Tobias's testimony written carefully into his notebook and a promise to Ivy that he'd send word the moment he had something solid enough to bring before a judge. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep, he told her, but he'd seen enough that night. In the way she fought for a family that wasn't legally hers, in the way 3 children who'd learned not to trust strangers had opened their whole hearts to her in under a week, to believe her story over a rancher's reputation any day. He paused at the edge of the yard before mounting his horse and told Silas one more thing quietly, man to man, that he'd been a deputy for 15 years and had rarely seen anyone fight that hard for people who weren't even blood, and that Kestrel Ranch would be foolish to let a woman like that walk away come spring. 3 days later, a second rider arrived at Kestrel Ranch, not with a warrant this time, but with a signed statement from a ranch hand who'd finally come forward once he heard Cole was under investigation. Admitting he'd been paid to look the other way the night that fire started, Silas found Ivy in the barn that afternoon, checking the same wall they'd braced together during the worst of the storm, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before finally saying what he'd been circling around since the night he first opened his door to a stranger with nothing but a canvas bag and an impossible offer. He told her the ranch had never once felt like a home until the week she showed up uninvited and started fixing everything he'd been too tired to notice was broken, including, he admitted quietly, parts of himself he hadn't realized needed fixing at all. His voice caught on the last few words, and he looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred from a decade of holding this ranch together alone, as if seeing for the first time how much they'd been shaking long before the storm ever gave him a reason to. Ivy didn't answer right away. She looked past him at Clara and Tobias racing across the yard, throwing snowballs at Tucker the ranch dog, laughing in a way neither child had laughed since before their mother died. And something in her chest finally settled after months of running from a truth that had finally caught up with the people willing to believe it. That spring, when the charges against Ivy were formally dropped and Bertram Cole was arrested for arson and the death of an innocent man, nobody at Kestrel Ranch celebrated with any grand announcement. Silas simply handed Ivy a folded piece of paper across the kitchen table one evening. A permanent arrangement this time, no more talk of temporary, no more conditions repeated twice for his own protection. Clara, who still hadn't managed a single full sentence to Ivy that first terrible week, wrapped both arms around her that night and said only 2 words, quiet enough that Silas had to lean in to hear them. Stay forever outside. The snow that had once threatened to bury this family completely had already begun to melt off the fence line, and somewhere beneath it, the first green shoots of a spring, none of them had been certain they'd survive to see, were already pushing their way up through the thawing ground. And if this story reminded you that the people who show up when everything is falling apart are the ones worth holding on to, that sometimes the family you build matters more than the one you're born into, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told, and I would be honored to have you here for every single one of them.